Anne Boleyn had been a fierce spark in a religious movement that would change her daughter's life forever. Elizabeth would lose her mother on the scaffold at the tender age of 3 and will be labelled a bastard throughout her life. But what relationship did these remarkable queens have during their tragically brief life together? What impact did Anne have on her legendary daughter? In 1533, Anne Boleyn was at the very height of her power. She had been crowned superbly in Westminster Abbey with all the splendour of a full monarchic ceremony, and she was carrying the king's child. Henry had longed for a son to secure the newly established Tudor dynasty begun by his father Henry VII. Henry himself knew how precarious a succession could be. He himself had been the spare to Prince Arthur's heir until the said prince's unexpected death on the 2nd of April 1502. It had become an obsession for Henry to beget sons, and Catherine, his first queen, had failed magnificently. The heavy burden now lay on Anne's shoulders. The summer progress was abandoned by Henry so that Anne could rest at Windsor and wait in time to take to her chamber. On the 21st of August 1533, Anne carefully left Windsor for Whitehall, and 2 days later left to Greenwich. On arriving at the palace, Henry bid farewell to his new bride, and Anne retired from masculine life and began her lying in. The custom of taking to one's chamber was an ancient one, based on medical and religious ideas. Anne was, in effect, locked in her suite of rooms. The rooms were hung with heavy tapestries to block out the light and to ease the mood of the expectant mother. A room was especially prepared as an oratory in case of a weak baby needing instant baptism. A state bed was placed in the Queen's presence chamber instead of her throne, and male entry was strictly forbidden. Henry had announcements drawn up proclaiming the birth of a son, and a magnificent joust was organised to mark the birth of a prince. On the 7th of September 1533, Anne safely delivered what would be her only child, a daughter, Elizabeth. It would be wrong to suggest that Henry and Anne were not disappointed at the birth, but the level of disappointment must not be exaggerated. Henry did not fly into a black mood, and it was far from the beginning of the end of their relationship. Henry cancelled the joust, as he had at the arrival of his now illegitimate daughter, Mary, and the letters of announcement were distributed with an additional S crammed at the end of prince to create princess. Despite many myths, it appears that Anne's labour with Elizabeth was an easy one, and Elizabeth was perfectly formed. It is safe to say that the general mood from Henry would have been relief at the birth of a healthy child that bore his looks. On the 10th of September 1533, 3 days after her birth, Elizabeth was christened. She was bathed in hot water, and the procession that followed her carried 500 lit torches. Great bonfires followed, and London drank herself dry with free wine for all. Anne had yet to be churched, and as tradition demanded was not present at the christening. However, it was a triumphant occasion for her, and was used to humiliate her enemies. The Duke of Suffolk escorted the child, and the Marchioness of Exeter, a great friend and supporter of Catherine, had been called upon as one of the godmothers. The Duke of Norfolk rushed from France to officiate as Earl Marshal for the event, and Anne's father supported the Princess Purple train. George Boleyn was the first of 4 nobles to carry the canopy over Elizabeth. Rumours set about that the child would be named Mary. However, the court sighed with relief as the Garter King of Arms announced, "God, in his infinite goodness, send prosperous life and long to the high and mighty Princess of England, Elizabeth." Mary had escaped with her name, but she would lose her birth title of princess to the newly born child, and deep scars began to appear. Elizabeth was quickly taken to her new apartments in the Greenwich Palace, and it was quickly evident to the untrained Queen Anne that Elizabeth's upbringing would be wholly different to her relatively ordinary one. History leads us to believe that Anne would have liked to have breastfed Elizabeth. However, there is no contemporary evidence to support this notion. Although Anne would have had a much simpler upbringing, it is likely that she too would have had a wet nurse, as did Elizabeth. Anne did, however, take an unusually keen interest in her daughter's well-being. She was keen that Elizabeth should be established in her own household, away from court life, but close at hand. It was decided on the 2nd of December, 1533, that Elizabeth should reside at Hatfield House. Mary was sent to Hatfield, and on arrival was asked by the Duke of Norfolk if she would pay her respects to the Princess Elizabeth. Her response was that no other lady in England held the title of princess save herself, and that the child of the Lady of Pembroke held no such title. She would submit, however, to calling her sister, as she had called the bastard Fitzroy brother. Anne was determined to suppress Mary, and ordered her ears boxed whenever she used the title princess inappropriately. It is obvious that Anne made a very clear definition between her stepdaughter and her beloved child. Anne doted on her daughter, showering her with gifts and introducing her to the world of fashion. She sent for the finest milliners to measure the Princess Elizabeth's head for caps and headdresses, and wardrobes of the finest clothes were delicately created, using the finest cloth and trimmings. Anne herself knew the importance that appearance could have with regards to status and position, and Elizabeth would keep this sense of style with her throughout her life, and would use it to her full advantage. Although she clearly adored her daughter, it was the king and council that decided the course of action for the princess. As queen, Anne could only have a partial say in what happened to her daughter, and it was the king that made the maternal decision to begin Elizabeth weaning at the age of 25 months. Anne did, however, write regularly to Lady Bryan, who had day-to-day control over the princess, with maternal suggestion. Towards the end of Anne's reign, it is clear that Elizabeth had become the very centre of her life. Anne was aware of an impending catastrophe. Quite what, she could not say. We know that Anne appealed to Henry 2 days before her arrest, and that Elizabeth was present in her mother's arms. Quite what the conversation was regarding, and what was said, has been lost in time. Although the use of Elizabeth between these powerfully destructive parents demonstrates the passion between them. Anne's mind was focused on Elizabeth's future at the time, and we can only guess at her fears. Did she picture her daughter at the hands of a stepmother, and regret her treatment of her own stepchild? 2 days prior to this emotional scene of despair, Anne had conversed deeply with her chaplain, Matthew Parker, regarding her daughter's future enrichment and education, and Parker insists that Anne placed Elizabeth into his spiritual care. We know nothing of Elizabeth's circumstances during her mother's arrest, trial, and execution. We can only begin to dare to imagine the torture that Anne faced, with the reality that her heir would be demoted to illegitimate status. Elizabeth had been the prized fruit of Anne's political and emotional battle for the crown, and her impending execution would leave Elizabeth open for abuse and destruction. Elizabeth will be returned to Hatfield in disgrace following her mother's end. Lady Bryan's touching letter to Cromwell, pleading for new clothes for her ward, show the level of neglect that Elizabeth was now subjected to without her mother's care, and neither court nor Elizabeth barely spoke of her mother again. But what does this wall of silence say about Elizabeth's perception of her mother? The answer lies within a ring that Elizabeth had commissioned. Within a hidden locket, 2 striking portraits meet, mother and daughter. This touching tribute speaks volumes about Elizabeth's opinion of her distant mother. But why did Elizabeth choose such a discreet memorial? The answer is, for me, that Anne's memory was incredibly intimate, personal, and undoubtedly painful subject for Elizabeth. Her touching ring speaks far louder than any words ever could have. Anne's death would mean years of struggle, torment, and danger for the young and vulnerable Elizabeth. But I strongly believe that Anne's murder shaped a future that forced invaluable lessons that would form Gloriana, undoubtedly the greatest monarch England has ever known.